America, America the beautiful, America, God shed his grace on thee. You know, we've all sung those words. But lately, we're asking ourselves, is America a post-Christian nation? Because some disappointing things are happening.
I think it's a great question, because oftentimes when I think about America as a post-Christian nation, I look at it in comparison with Europe. People talk about post-Christian Europe and when all that happened. And I think the real question, which I would love to get your thoughts on, Gary, is how do we define America being a Christian nation? We know that the word God does not appear in the Constitution. The word God specifically doesn't appear in many of the other official documents. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence uses the word creator.
Yes.
And but there are those that say that America was never a overtly Christian nation in the sense of founded upon Jesus Christ. There's no doubt that they were theists. They were deists in that regard.
Yes. They believed in God's existence.
They believed in God's existence. They believe in providence and no doubt Benjamin Franklin and others. But so people talk about whether we were ever Christian, but no matter what, when you go and you see the growth of our country in the beginning, there's no doubt it became very Christian with the churches and the foundational time frame. Certainly 1600s, 1700s, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, etc. So how do we define, before we say whether it's post, how do we define a marker there? What do you think?
Was Christianity ever a compelling movement in America? And I would say yes. And I go back in my mind to the days leading up to the Civil War. The Civil War had a lot of interpretive Christian belief. And you had factions in the South who had one type of Christian belief, factions in the North who had another type of Christian belief. But America's leaders in the North certainly were believers in God. And
imperfect as they were, but they were believers, right? Yeah, nobody's perfect.
True. And in the South, they had a slightly different approach, a more formal approach to Christianity. And they eventually, after the Civil War, evolved a sort of a compatibility with the northern states. And from that point on, and I think of like 1865 to maybe 1948 as a time when we had a Christian ethos in this country, where in government, before people did anything, they prayed about it. They actually had ideas like, would God approve of this? You know, you'd hear people making statements like that or asking questions. I think that began to fade out starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then with increasing speed in the last 3 decades. So I think America was more Christian then than it was now. But again, how would you put it? Would you say that we were ever a Christian nation?
You know, that's a great question. We were a theistic nation, but I think it's really hard to define, because many of the founding fathers were very specific Christian. And here's an interesting topic, or thought. Many people get a little upset, but I think if they do the research, they'll find that this is the truth. We often talk about Thomas Jefferson as an example, where Thomas Jefferson was not a Trinitarian.
Right.
Many of them were Unitarians, and they believed in God, but they denied the deity of Jesus. And Thomas Jefferson, as an example, thought very highly of Jesus's teachings in the Gospels. However, if you look at his Jefferson Bible, and you actually spend the time to research it, it's fascinating to see how he promoted prayer. But in his Jefferson Bible, he cut out things that he didn't like everything that Jesus said. So he didn't just submit. If it's the red letters, then it must be true. You know, you think about Matthew 10, where Jesus tells you to fear God, who can cast both your body and soul into Gehenna. Well, those kind of things he didn't like. But certainly loving your neighbor, all the positive things, the ethical things that the way that he phrased it, he embraced. But he denied the uniqueness and the deity of Christ, John 1:1, and other passages. So when you look at the founding fathers, many of them were pastors, but some of them were part of a Unitarian. So that's not Christian in the way that we understand acknowledging first and foremost the deity of Jesus or the exclusivity of Jesus in John 14:6. But as we think about, well, I think what you nailed it, Gary, in that if you look at the early 1900s, that's when we put "In God We Trust" on the currency.
Right.
But what I see then is you have this initial religious foundation. There's no doubt we were religious. The country was founded in a religious way. Specifically, the way that we understand Christianity, probably not so much. But certainly a lot of the population was that way. Because it is true, you won't find mention of God in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or anything, but we do have the foundation of a creator, which is very Unitarian in the Declaration of Independence.
Here's my reaction. After World War I, there was a terrible depression in America. I'm talking about an emotional depression, and in Europe. And communism began to rise, like Marxism. And if you look at what was happening in Russia, in China, and Eastern Europe and so forth after World War I, and then culminating in Hitler, Hitler was a National Socialist and certainly was anti-God in the most amazing ways.
But yet had a form, because, he had a form of godliness. A form of godliness because, he did... Anyways, he leveraged what he could, but his actions clearly were not.
Where I'm moving on this is that after World War I think America was a Christian nation. It was a time of, let's get moral here. And it was a time when whiskey barrels and
Prohibition, right?
Liquor bottles, during the Prohibition era, where liquor bottles were being smashed in the streets. So we've all seen the old movies. And there was kind of if you can call it that, a revival.
Yeah, like a preponderance of revival all through and real.
And then I think there was another revival after World War II. People were so thankful that World War II had finally come to an end. Israel became a nation, 1948. Things began to change in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I think there was a time when America really was building churches, building a society. They still taught. In fact, I remember that they taught about Jesus in many schools.
Yeah.
Many schools had textbooks, actually, that featured Bible quotes. And then that all faded out around the 70s and 80s, and it's been downhill ever since. So, yes, America is a post-Christian nation in that sense, but I still believe there are a lot of Bible-believing Christians in America.